beginning a new series, if you didn't guess it, on the book of Ruth. And Ruth is one of those stories that all the way through it, particularly as the story concludes, you just find yourself going, what the heck? Like, holy cow, oh my goodness. And so I've entitled this series, and I'm pretty happy with this. Are you ready for it? I've entitled this series, stRUTH. Come on, is that good? Thank you, Stacey. If you weren't here last week, we changed it up a little bit. We had a bit of a Bible college lecture on how to read the Bible well. And one of the things that we looked at was unpacking how the Bible has a particular genre. That when it comes to literature, the Bible has a particular genre. And that genre informs how we're supposed to read the Bible. The other thing we briefly looked at last week that informs how we read the Bible is the fact that there are different literary styles within the Bible that inform how we should understand it. Now, I haven't done a spot test for a while, but I'm feeling pretty faithful and game. Does anyone remember what the three different literary styles in the Bible were? The three main ones. Narrative. Oh, come on, Ed. Poetry. Prose. Give yourself a round of applause. You do listen. Now, one of those we looked at a little bit in more detail, which was narrative. And we zoomed in on it a little bit. Not just because half of the entire Bible is written in the literary style of narrative, but because I knew that this week we're starting a series in the book of Ruth, which is a narrative. And what was the underlying question, and this will test you maybe, what was the underlying question that we must ask when we read narrative? Not what is the author telling us with their words, but what is the author showing us? Yes, you're doing well. And the author shows us things, we said, through three things. The setting, characters, and ultimately the plot. So keep that in mind as we dive into this chapter, Ruth chapter 1. Why don't you read aloud with me the first couple of verses of this. Ready? It says, let's go. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Well done. I think I'll take it from there. Only because it's a little bit slower when we read it all together, right? I don't want you to be here till lunchtime. All right, so the first line in our story or in the narrative is usually what we call the setting, right? The first line. It's usually the first line. And it's where the author gives us context for what's about to unfold. And the setting of this book, of the book of Ruth, is very brief but very important. And I wondered, did you catch it when we read it? It said this is the setting, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. That's our setting. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, rather than just read that and kind of vaguely get what's going on, we need to make sure we fully appreciate what the setting is, because it becomes the backdrop or the context for the rest of the entire story. So I want to ask you a question. What do you think the author means when he says, in the days that the judges ruled? What do you think he's talking about? Any takers? I'll put you out of your misery. He's talking about a specific time in Israel's history. You see, before Israel becomes a monarch and gets their first king, there's this period of time where God rescues and instructs Israel by raising up a judge, by raising up a God-fearing military figure to rescue them from the oppression of their enemies. Think about people like Gideon or Samson or Deborah. These were some of Israel's judges. And one of the things that defined this period in Israel's history was that it was characterized by evil, sin, and disobedience. Judges 21 verse 25 comments about this period of time saying this: at that time, there was no king in Israel, and people did whatever they felt like doing. And this is the backdrop of our story, right? People doing whatever they feel like doing, even if it was in direct opposition to what Yahweh wanted. However, the author adds one more contributing factor to the setting. Not only does the book of Ruth take place in the days when the judges ruled, but there was a famine in the land. Now, we often hear the word famine and think, okay, they had to ration a bit, right? All right, maybe sweet potato was a little bit pricey, but it's not the end of the world. But literally, for people in ancient Israel, it was pretty much close to the end of the world. You see, an agrarian society didn't just depend on the production of food for their livelihood. They depended on it for their survival, right? And so if rain didn't come, or if it came too late, or if it was too hot or not hot enough, then famine struck. And famine, rather than meaning, we're going to have to postpone our, international trip to Paris this year because things are a little bit tight. No. Famine meant choosing, catch this, choosing which of your children you would malnourish first. That's the kind of impact that famine brought. Famine meant high stakes. Famine meant serious pressure. And this is our setting. An environment characterized by disobedience and high stakes pressure. And it's in light of this that the story then begins. Let's keep reading. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. All right. Now, what was one of the things that we learned about the genre of the Bible last week when it pertains to detail? Remember that the Bible typically isn't flush with much detail, right? And so when it offers us detail, what do we have to do? Pay attention. All right, so let's look at this. So a man from not just any old place, a man from Bethlehem, okay? Why are they telling us the specific town that he was from? Together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Again, why are they giving us specific destination? Now, having been initially generic about a man, his wife, and 2 sons, now the author comes back to specifically tell us their names. Why? Verse 2. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. There's that name of the specific town that they're from again. And they went to Moab and lived there. Again, the author mentions the destination a second time, now really emphasizing it, and we have to ask why. So let's look at some of this detail. Because detail in the Bible is never just about color and artistry, right? It's always there to show us the author's intent. So let's start with Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem is a combination of two Hebrew words, Beth and Lachem. Everyone say Lachem. Don't spit on your neighbor as you do that. And it literally means house of bread. All right? House of bread, Bethlehem. Elimelech means God is my king. God is my king. Naomi means lovely or pleasant one. Mahlon means to fall ill. Imagine being called that. Even better is his brother, Kilian, which means to fade away or eventually perish. Killer names. What about Moab? What's the significance of this detail? Twice the author stressed the particular destination that they were going. Well, let me tell you, Moab wasn't just any old town. It was literally Israel's sworn enemy. Not only was it a place and a culture that detested Yahweh and promoted pretty much everything that Israel stood against, but when the book of Ruth was written, Israel had just come out of Moab in slavery. They'd just come out of oppression and in slavery of the Moabites. Like for an Israelite, you literally couldn't get worse than Moab, right? And so in a time that was characterized by people disobeying Yahweh, follow this, doing as they pleased, we have a man crack under pressure because of a famine in Israel, and he leaves Israel. He leaves the promised land, the very geography that Yahweh's provision was tied to, in search of provision or bread in enemy territory. And so the author emphasizes this through the use of detail. Catch this, you ready? This is cool. Elimelech, the man who professes that God is my king, instead of trusting Yahweh, leaves Bethlehem, leaves the house of bread, in search of bread, in search of provision in Moab. In enemy territory, outside of Yahweh's provision. You ever tried to do something in your own strength? To make something happen for yourself when God doesn't seem to be at work? To leave the way and provision of Yahweh and look to other things? Look to other systems? Look to other people or other avenues for your provision or salvation instead of trusting God? Anyone ever done that, or just me? How does it often end? Tragedy, badly. Blowing up in your face, causing us to hit rock bottom. And this is what happens, verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Now, remember the meanings of the two sons' names were to fall ill and to eventually perish. The author is preempting something with this detail. Verse 4. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And they had lived there for about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Kilian also died. To fall ill and to eventually perish. They both died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. Isn't it amazing the degree of richness that you begin to get from the text and the meaning when you pay attention to detail, right? Elimelech has made a dumb decision, right? He's disobeyed God. He's left the house of bread, he's left the provision of God, and he's gone looking for it elsewhere, and surprise, surprise, it ends in tragedy. However, the most fascinating part is who has to contend with the tragedy. Is it Elimelech? Is it his sons? No, it's Naomi, right? Naomi has to contend with this tragedy. And as a woman in that society, she would have had no say in leaving when they went to Moab. And I can't help but imagine Naomi standing there pleading with Elimelech. Don't go! Not Moab! We just have to hang in there and trust Yahweh. He'll come through. He'll provide. He always does. And yet here she is now, bearing the consequences of someone else's choice, faced with utter tragedy. You ever been faced with tragedy because of someone else's choice? Maybe you were sexually abused. Maybe your mum and dad left when you were a kid. Maybe your spouse left or a friend left. Maybe you were the victim of a drunk driver or someone else's violence. Maybe it was sickness or disease, and whatever it was, you found yourself facing utter tragedy for something outside of your control. And I have to stress here, what Naomi was facing was no small hiccup, right? This was not even just a situation of deep and painful grief. This was a full-blown tragedy. You know the kind of situation you find yourself in? I hope you haven't found yourself in more than once or twice. When you're in the fetal position and honestly just even being alive seems hard enough. You know what I'm talking about? That's the tragedy. That's the kind of situation that Naomi is in. Not only had she lost her husband and her 2 children, she had literally lost her capacity for provision. I mean, women had it hard enough in ancient times, relying totally on men for their provision and welfare. But old ladies with no sons, man, that was as close to game over as you could get. And this is the backdrop in many ways of what emerges to be one of the underlying themes in this story. What do you do when you have zero hope and all seems lost? Well, let's see what Naomi does. Verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Okay, so Naomi starts back home. And probably a day or 2 into the journey, all of a sudden, she has a bit of an epiphany, right? The reality of her situation begins to dawn on her as she realizes the kind of life that she's actually heading back to. She realizes that she will be a destitute beggar. That she's a dissenter, right? She's a dissenter, having left Israel and teamed up with the enemy when things got hard in Israel. Now she's on her way back. And all she has to look forward to is epic shame and probable starvation. Not only that, she probably realizes on the road that even less welcome than her will be her hated Moabite daughter-in-laws, right? And so she kind of has this double take. And she says, actually, you know what, ladies? You need to go back home. You need to turn around. You can't come with me. Now, remember when we said that narrative is all about what the author wants to show us, and that they do that through setting, plot, and characters? Well, the way authors most often use their characters to show the reader something is through the characters' dialogue. Okay? And so when the narrator stops talking and begins to talk through the characters, it's usually a way to emphasize their point or message, and I think this is the case here. You see, the author has put no dialogue in the characters' mouths up until now, right? But all of a sudden, he puts dialogue in Naomi's mouth and Ruth's mouth. And the author uses Naomi to say two important things in her dialogue with Orpah and Ruth that are vital in understanding this story. Verse 8. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home." And here's the first one. "May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Here's a fun fact. Whenever you see a word repeated in quick succession in the Bible, like the author repeating Bethlehem twice or Moab twice in the introduction, it's not because they think we're dumb, right? This is not a lady talking to her husband thinking he didn't catch it the first time. They're telling us twice because it's significant. And the word kindness that Naomi repeats twice in one sentence is very important to the overarching story. The Hebrew word for kindness is hesed. And it's one of those words that is so rich in meaning that our English language just doesn't do it justice. The problem is, to convey its full and accurate meaning, you really need about 3 or 4 English words. But translators avoid this, right, because it begins to make the sentence kind of clunky and not flow. However, the word hesed, in its most literal sense, means something more like this: undeserved, loyal, loving kindness. Undeserved, loyal, loving kindness. And I want you to catch this. It's not just generic kindness. It's specifically undeserved and it's loyal in nature. And I want you to pay attention to this as this Hesed love becomes a theme as we move forward. All right, the second thing Naomi says that we have to pay attention to is in verse 13. So she's had an epiphany. She realizes that life is going to suck with a capital S, not just for her, but even more for her single Moabite daughter-in-laws. And so she tells them, "Go home." Verse 9. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" Implied answer, no. So Naomi is saying, don't be crazy, right? Don't be crazy. Go home. It makes 0 sense for you to come with me. Do the sensible thing and go home. That's where you have the best chance of landing on your feet. And having laid out her argument, Naomi then says what seems like an unrelated throwaway line in verse 13. "No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." However, you and me both know, post our Bible college lecture, that when it comes to detail in the Bible, right, that it's never unrelated or throwaway, correct? You know the line, "No, my daughters, it's more bitter for you than for me because the Lord has turned against me." This becomes a crucial emphasis in the chapter. You see, what the author is emphasizing, and will do even more so in the verses that follow, is this: that Naomi is bitter. Everyone say bitter. Naomi is bitter. Naomi's synopsis of the tragedy that's befallen her is this: God's abandoned me. In fact, he hasn't just abandoned me, but because he hasn't rescued me, this is his fault. The Lord's hand is turned against me, and I'm going to be angry and bitter about it. You ever found yourself in a situation that you thought was unfair? A situation you felt like God abandoned you in? A situation that he didn't come through in the way or the timing that you wanted him to? That your suffering or tragedy was his fault? And instead of hanging in there, because you couldn't see from your human perspective how on earth it could work out, like Elimelech, you left Bethlehem. You left the house of bread. You left the very context of God's provision and looked for it elsewhere on your own terms, in your own strength. You went off to the enemy, to the world, to the culture, to seek their provision, which is a phony provision at best. Cheap sex, cheap wine, fleeting friends, fleeting success, money, Instagram likes, or you erected a concrete wall around your heart so thick that no one could ever hurt you again. That's phony provision. Not only that, then you did a Naomi and got angry and bitter toward God. Maybe you still are. You know, too many Christians do this, whether with their whole lives or just a part of their life. They lose a child. Their marriage breaks down. They get wounded or hurt or buffeted by the storms of life. And rather than stay in Bethlehem, rather than stay in the very place, the very rhythms, the very context that Yahweh's provision can reach them, they go off to Moab. And they harden their hearts with bitterness and anger when things get worse. Maybe that's you this morning. Maybe that's the story of your entire life. Or maybe you've done your best to compartmentalize. And that's just the story of one particular area. Well, let's continue to read, because if anyone gets you, Naomi does, right? And the author begins to ever so slightly reveal the answer to Naomi's accusation that God, how dare you abandon me? This is all your fault. All right, so Naomi has convinced Orpah to go home, and she's tried a second time to persuade Ruth to leave her. But Ruth replies with what is just an epic monologue. Verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. It's a pretty epic statement, right? So Ruth turns to Naomi and she's like, I am not going anywhere, right? She's like, I'm staying put. And here's the crazy part. I need you to catch this. Ruth has an out. Ruth has an out. Ruth has a future. When Naomi has nothing, Ruth has prospects. When Naomi is hopeless, Ruth has hope. And yet, staring down the barrel, considering her future, a life of possible comfort. A new husband, a new journey, new provisions, new securities in her homeland. She says all of that, she sees all of it, and says, no, I'm with you. If you're going to starve, I'm going to starve with you. If you're going to beg, I'm going to beg with you. I don't care if I'm despised and hated as a Moabite pig. I'm with you. I've got your back. I mean, this is incredible, right? What a gesture. Now, let me ask you something, because this is where it gets cool. If we were to try and capture this devotion, describe the kind of commitment that Ruth shows, completely voluntary, completely undeserved, what Hebrew word do you think we might pick? Hesed love. Undeserved, loyal, loving kindness. You see, often we can lose focus of the plot in the book of Ruth. When we come to this amazing act of Hesed love, we get distracted by Ruth. We get distracted by what the author is telling us instead of what the author is showing us. And if we make the focal point Ruth's unbelievable Hesed love, we can miss the author's emphasis in all of this. And I think the emphasis is driven home by the end of this scene. Okay? Naomi and Ruth make it back to Bethlehem. The Bible says there's a bit of commotion in the town. And as she's greeted, this is what she has to say. Verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman explained, "Can this be Naomi?" Look at what she says. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." You catch this? Here she is again, playing the victim and angry. God has abandoned me. Don't call me the pleasant one. Call me Mara, which literally means bitter. You know, Naomi has faced awful tragedy. There's no question. No one's denying that. But rather than stand firm and trust in the provision of Yahweh, she has sunk her roots into bitterness. Because of this, she can't see how God is at work. Because she can't see how God is at work from a human perspective, she accuses him of abandoning her. She allows her bitterness and hurt to cloud the truth that God is the God of Hesed love, of undeserved, loyal, loving commitment to his faithful children, even in the midst of what seems like total calamity. And here's the clinch, all right? If we allow bitterness and hurt to callous our heart, even in the midst of God's provision, we can miss it. But you think about this. Naomi has just received, right? She has just received, been the recipient of, one of the most profound displays of Hesed love in the entire Bible, right? Yahweh uses Ruth, her trust and her faithfulness in him, to display his loyal faithfulness and commitment to Naomi. And yet she misses it. Having having experienced all of that, having been the object of all of that, she arrives back to Bethlehem and says, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. Because Yahweh's abandoned me. He's failed to rescue me. Friends, we cannot underestimate the power of hurt and bitterness in our heart. We can cling so tight to pain and hurt sometimes that even as God begins to turn things around, begins to open doors, begins to pour out this undeserved, loyal commitment of hesed love and kindness toward us, we miss it. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians. Now I'm glad, not that you whoa, do you not have that? All right, I'll read it to you. One too shy. Now I'm glad, not that you experienced pain, but that you were jarred into turning things around. You let the pain and distress bring you to God, not drive you from Him. The result was all gain, no loss, Paul says. Verse 10. Distress that drives us, this is Paul speaking, distress that drives us to God does that. It turns us around. It gets us back in the way of salvation. We never regret the kind of pain. We never regret that kind of pain, Paul says. But those who let pain and distress drive them away from God are full of regrets and end up on a deathbed of regrets. Friends, I believe this is the question of the first chapter of Ruth. What will you do with pain and tragedy? You won't escape it. You've probably already experienced it, but you have a choice. Will you take it to God? Will you trust in Him and trust His provision? Or will you bathe in that pain and hurt? Getting so bitter like Naomi that even when God begins to pour out His hesed love on you, His undeserved love and favor and commitment and loyalty, that you totally miss it. My prayer this morning was Paul's hope that we would allow our pain and hurt and tragedy, catch this, to drive us to God, not away from Him. Amen? Because that's where salvation is found. Amen? Let's pray.